أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين ولا يحسبن الذين يبخلون بما آتاهم الله من فضله هو خيرا لهم بل هو شر لهم سيطوقون ما بخلوا به يوم القيامة ولله ميراث السماوات والأرض والله بما تعملون خبير. Allah Almighty says in the Holy Quran, and let not those who are niggardly or those who are stingy with respect to what Allah has given them of His bounty think that it is good for them. No, it is evil for them. That with respect to which they are stingy shall be put as a collar around their necks on the day of resurrection. And to Allah belongs the heritage of the heavens and the earth, and Allah is well aware of what you do. In this verse, Allah Almighty has described that those who hold back from spending in the cause of Allah Almighty and are materialistic and are stingy with what Allah Ta'ala has provided for them, it seems to them and it perhaps seems to others that it is something that is good for them. But in reality, it is something that is bad for them. And Allah Ta'ala says that it will be a source of punishment for them in the hereafter. Now that punishment is something that no doubt comes in the hereafter. But one thing that Allah Almighty has described in the Holy Quran is that the punishment of the hereafter and the reward of the hereafter are things that begin in this very life. And whatever reward that we are to earn, we taste some of it in this life. And whatever punishment a person is destined to receive, it is something that he cannot leave this world without having already felt to a degree. Hazrat Masih Maud has described this in detail and has said that this kind of misconception that arises in the hearts of people who are either materialistic or who are impressed by materialism is something that is only a result of short-sightedness. But when a person looks deeper into the reality of where people are and how they feel, then they will find that materialism is not at all a source of happiness, nor is wealth a source of happiness. So developing this depth of insight that the promised Messiah ﷺ had is necessary to first not be impressed by trivial things like the amount of wealth people have. And then secondly, after having overcome that obstacle, it is to redefine our own sense of what is valuable and what is important in life. The promised Messiah ﷺ says that कोई ये ना कहे कि कुफ़ार के पास भी माल और दौलत और इमलाक होते हैं और वो अपनी ऐश व इशरत में मुनहमिक और मस्त रहते हैं. मैं तुम्हें सच कहता हूँ कि वो दुनिया की आंख में बल्कि ज़लील दुनियादारों और ज़ाहिर परस्तों की आंख में खुश मालूम देते हैं, मगर दर हकीकत वो एक जलन और दुख में मुब्तला होते हैं. तुमने उनकी सूरत को देखा है, मगर मैं ऐसे लोगों के कल्ब पर निगाह करता हूँ. Huzur said that no one should say that the disbelievers enjoy wealth and sovereignty, and that because of this happiness and this sort of extravagant life that they live, so as a result of that perhaps they are happy or they have serenity. Huzur said that in reality it is only those people who are materialistic or whose vision is confined to the lowliness of this world, who are distracted by such things and who think that they are happy. Huzur says that the reality is that they are in a state of burning, in a state of pain, in a state of restlessness. This exists within them. He says that you look at their outward appearance, but I look at the condition of their hearts. So this is the ultimate end of materialism that Huzur has described. And it is not something that applies only to the hereafter, but it is something that begins in this very world. And this is an insight that not everyone has. But despite being a believer, and despite being a person who is a Muslim, it is possible for the materialism to exist within a person. And this is a good test by which a person can see whether that materialism actually exists within them or not. If they're impressed by the wealth of others, or if they see the condition of someone's heart and see the real state of restlessness that exists within them. There's a story about Hazrat Junaid Baghdadi of how he saw the restlessness that existed within someone and was able to use his insight to give him proper guidance. It is narrated that once a person came to Hazrat Junaid Baghdadi while he was sitting perhaps in Mecca with others of his followers, and he offered him a gift of 500 dirhams. And he said that, I offer this as a gift to you to distribute among your dervishes. Hazrat Junaid Baghdadi asked him, that do you have more money than this, what you have given me? He said, yes, I do have more money. I have much more money than this. Hazrat Junaid asked him that, do you have a desire for more than what you already have? He said that, yes, I do want more money than what I already have. So Hazrat Junaid replied to him that you keep this money because you have greater need for it than we do. What he taught that person was that so long as a person has greed within his heart for wealth, for further wealth than what he already possesses, then that burning and that flame, that thing that Hazrat Masih Maud has described here, that is a sign of true poverty. Whether a person is wealthy or not is not a sign of affluence. But no matter how much wealth a person has, but if he burns in that desire for more money, and if he is concerned with what he presently has and what he may lose, then that is a true poverty that a person should receive sympathy for, not something that we should look at them with praise for, we should admire them for. And so this is the sympathy that Hazrat Junaid rahimahullah ta'ala expressed towards him. Even those people who were with him, though they were poor and though they were perhaps destitute in the eyes of the world, but they were content within themselves. And that was the greatest affluence and privilege that they could receive. Hazrat Masih Maud goes on to say, describing those people who are wealthy and materialistic, that वो एक सईर और सलासिल और अगलाल में जगड़े हुए हैं, जैसे फरमाया है इन्ना अअतदना लिलकाफिरीना सलासिल व अगलालन व सईरा, वो नेकी की तरफ आ ही नहीं सकते, वो ऐसे अगलाल में हैं कि खुदा की तरफ उन अगलाल की वजह से ऐसे दबे पड़े हैं कि हैवानों और बहाइम से भी बदतर होते हैं. Huzur said that such people are trapped in chains and in collars, as Allah Almighty has described in the Holy Quran, that surely we have prepared for the disbelievers chains and collars and a burning punishment. They cannot even come towards righteousness and doing good deeds. And because of these chains and collars that are around them, they are pressed towards the ground and pushed downwards like animals, and they are incapable of doing goodness. This is an allegorical description of what materialism does to a person's soul, what it does to a person's being. That in the same way that animals are held down by the different chains and leashes that are placed on them to keep them in control, so in the same way a person who sort of buys in to the rat race that there is, to the materialism that surrounds them, then they get tied down to that very race. In searching for that freedom of affluence and riches, it itself becomes a prison that a person traps themselves in. And so this metaphor becomes something that is fitting to such people. Huzur then goes on to say that उनकी आंख हर वक्त दुनिया की तरफ ही लगी रहती है और ज़मीन की तरफ झुकते जाते हैं, फिर अंदर ही अंदर सोजिश और जलन भी लगी हुई होती है. अगर माल में कमी हो जाए या हस्ब मुराद तदबीर में कामयाबी ना हो तो कुरते और जलते हैं, यहाँ तक कि बाज़ औक़ात सौदाई और पागल हो जाते हैं या अदालतों में मारे मारे फिरते हैं. ये वाकई बात है कि बेदीन आदमी सईर से खाली नहीं होता, इसलिए कि उसको करार और सुकून नसीब नहीं होता. Huzur describes that such people are in a state of burning within themselves. If they suffer any loss with regards to their wealth, if they had any hopes or any plans about gaining wealth and it does not come through, then they burn within themselves and keep on plotting and trying to find different ways of a solution for it. It consumes them from within, to the point that some people reach an extent that they begin to lose their mind. or they go from one place to another. They go from one court to another trying to claim the wealth that they thought was their right. Hazur says that the reality is that a person who does not have any religion or does not have any righteousness in him, he is not free of this fire that exists within him. And it is not possible for that person to find that peace of mind and that serenity which can only be had by a person who is righteous. This description that the promised Messiah ﷺ has given of restlessness is something that any person who has any degree of materialism within themselves experiences to an extent. And that is the punishment of the hereafter that a person begins to experience in this world, and that it is necessary to free ourselves of in this very world. Many times when we see that someone has done a certain action or gotten involved in some trivial disagreement with someone, has gotten into a case in fighting over a certain amount of wealth or anything, and it seems surprising to us that someone would go to such an extent to fight over wealth to that degree. What we are seeing there is not something that is so unusual or so foreign to us, but it is actually a symptom of that same materialism that exists, that as Masih Maud has described here. That when someone has such a desire for wealth or for whatever it is that exists within his heart, when he suffers a loss in that regard, that it makes him restless and he constantly schemes to try and get it back. And as long as a person has that materialism, it is inevitable that that behavior come forward, that these symptoms come forward. For example, when people get into an argument, they may start to argue over something that seems small and irrelevant on the surface. But the reason why arguments often get prolonged between people is because it is no longer a disagreement about the issue that is under dispute, but it is a disagreement now about a person being offended by the loss of his ego. When someone says something about us that we find disrespectful, when someone says something that we feel takes away from our dignity, from our status, then that is the loss that we actually felt. Not the point that was proven against us, not that argument that was proven against us, or not that fact that was proven against us, but it is the loss of that dignity that actually bothers a person, which motivates him to go into an argument, into a heated debate with someone. As Masih Maud has described here, that when someone loses something contrary to their expectations, then they start to be burning within themselves. That they are restless within themselves. It is that restlessness that motivates a person to do things that we would otherwise consider absurd. Sometimes people, they watch daytime talk shows just to see how fascinating and amusing it is that people are involved in debates and discussions and arguments and almost get into fights over things that are trivial. And it's amusing because it is something that a person looks down on as they're watching it. But what we fail to realize is that whenever we ourselves get into an argument that is motivated by ego, then it is the same thing that we are doing, just on a different level. That ego that is motivated, and that ego that becomes our motivation, and that fire that becomes our motivation, that is what promotes these types of arguments. And so whenever a person finds that this fire that is Masih Maud is describing is the motivating force behind an action that they are doing, then they can see that this is the result of materialism. And such behavior will be done by them, which they otherwise would have considered far below themselves. Many people, when they get into an argument or a dispute with somebody, they say things that they regret later on. Even by their own standards of being a reasonable and polite person, they would never have fallen to that standard. But they do. Because that materialism is like a fuel that exists within a person. When we attach importance to that dignity that we have for ourselves, that self-respect, and when we attach importance to the wealth that we have, then when we suffer a loss in that wealth, then it is a spark that lands on that dormant fuel that we had been accumulating within ourselves. And when that spark lights up and that fire comes forward, and that fire motivates the actions that we go into, where we start to argue and debate with people over petty things, we start to fight with them and start to become uncompromising. That is in fact a symptom of that fuel that existed all along within ourselves. Another way that we see this come up in society is when people get into disputes over wealth. Whether it happens when there is a friendship or a business relationship that is deteriorating, whether there's financial disputes that come up among families, when there's a division of inheritance perhaps, or if it is at the time of a deterioration and dissolving of a marriage. There are sometimes long debates and arguments and even court cases that happen over insignificant amounts of money. Amounts of money that otherwise we may not have been even concerned with if we had lost it. if we had given it as a gift, or if we had done something else with it. But when we lose it unexpectedly to someone, and when our ego gets involved, then a person gets involved in different types of cases and situations that he otherwise would have considered himself as being far above. So when we see people in these types of situations, whatever they are, then it is a moment not to look down on them, but it is a moment, it is an opportunity for a moment of introspection. Because when we see somebody falling to this low, no matter what context it is in fact something that we ourselves may fall into at some point. Whether it is as extreme as the things that people show, that TV shows on daytime talk shows, or people are fighting and completely breaking down over different arguments that they have among their families. Whether it is court cases that happen over financial disputes between spouses and family members and business partners. Or even if it is an argument that is happening between two people over something that is otherwise trivial, but in reality is in fact over both of their egos feeling offended. The central reason behind all of these is that at some point or another, that person felt the loss that Hazrat Masih Maud has described here. They had an attachment to that wealth. And when they lost that wealth, then they felt that loss as a burning within themselves. They had an attachment to a false sense of pride, and when someone attacked that pride, then they felt that loss within themselves, and that raised that fire inside of them, that caused that sair to flame up. And as a result of that flame, the behavior that resulted was something that they themselves would have been embarrassed of. They themselves would have criticized. They themselves would have laughed at and mocked previously. But when that fire lit up within them, then all consequences were forgotten. And then everything that we would have otherwise considered to be decent and polite and civilized behavior ends up going out the window. So whether it is in a large degree or a small degree, these symptoms of materialism are things that we witness or perhaps we experience to a certain level. And that materialism is the root cause of many of the problems that arise in conflicts among people. Huzur goes on to write that ये वाकई बात है कि बेदीन आदमी सहीर से खाली नहीं होता, इसलिए कि उसको करार और सुकून नसीब नहीं होता, जो राहत और तसल्ली का लाजमी नतीजा है। जैसे शराबी एक जाम शराब पीकर एक और मांगता है और मांगता ही जाता है और एक जलन सी लगी रहती है, ऐसा ही दुनियादार भी सईर में है, उसकी आतिश आज एक दम भी बुझ नहीं सकती। सच्ची खुशहाली हकीकत में एक मुत्तकी ही के लिए है, जिसके लिए अल्लाह ताला ने वादा किया है कि उसके लिए दो जन्नत हैं. The promised Messiah ﷺ describes that a person who is materialistic can never have peace of heart and serenity, and some aspect of this fire continuously burns within him. And so this fire of having desire never leaves him. Huzur says that true serenity and happiness is only the lot of a person who is righteous, a person for whom Allah Almighty has promised that he will receive two paradises. What the promised Messiah ﷺ has indicated towards here is a verse in the Holy Quran wherein Allah Ta'ala describes that those who are believers and those who are truly righteous, for them are two paradises, one in this world and one in the hereafter. That the serenity and the happiness and the paradise that a person experiences in the hereafter is something that begins in this very world. And the way to achieve it is to let go of materialism. As Hazrat Junaid Baghdadi Rahimahullah Ta'ala described, that even those who were poor who were with him were in fact wealthy because they had peace of mind, because they were free of that greed that other people had. And that person who was wealthy, who was offering them a donation as if he was doing them a favor, was in fact the one who was truly suffering from poverty. And it was not just an allegorical sort of lesson that he sought to teach him. It wasn't just a metaphorical, beautiful phrase that he said to him that you have greater need for this wealth than we do. But he was serious about it. And it was a reality that despite that person being wealthy, he needed that money more than the poor followers of his needed it, because he had a greater desire for wealth in his heart, and because he had that agitation within him. So when we start looking at wealth and affluence from this perspective, then it can give us a different approach to life and a different approach to the different problems and troubles that we encounter in life. As Hazrat Masih Maud described in the beginning of this quote, that when you see wealthy people, they seem to be happy to you. They seem to have sovereignty and wealth and every facility that there is that life has to offer. But I look at the condition of their hearts and I see their real condition. And so they are deserving of greater sympathy than anyone else. And so as Muslims and as those who are trying to improve ourselves from within ourselves, it is important to first correct our perspective if there is any crookedness in it. That when we see someone who is wealthy, if we find ourselves admiring that person, looking up to that person, if we find ourselves being wholly impressed by them and bowing in their presence and just considering that person to have attained the real purpose of life within ourselves, then there is something that has seriously gone wrong in the priorities with which we identify ourselves and we identify others. But the direction that the promised Messiah ﷺ sought to take us in was to have a true understanding of the source of happiness and the reality of the world that we exist in. And when we develop that, then it can solve many of the tarbiyati problems that exist. So this criteria that Hazrat Masih Maud ﷺ gave is a good way to analyze ourselves from within. We should look at those people who are affluent in society around us. In this very materialistic society, there is no shortage of exposure that we have to people being glorified and people being placed in a high pedestal. And when we see such examples, when we meet such people, we can examine ourselves within our hearts to see how impressed am I by this person's status, by this person's presence, by what this person has accomplished. If we find ourselves impressed and feeling inferior to that person, then we can take that as a barometer to how much materialism exists within ourselves and how we look at ourselves and define our own worth. But if we can see people for the reality of their greatness, their righteousness, their honesty, their relationship with Allah Almighty and their spirituality, then if we look outwards from that perspective, then it is necessary that we also look within ourselves from that perspective as well. The way we look out towards the world is a sort of reflection of what principles and what ideals we have within ourselves. All of us in principle would agree with this quotation of Hazrat Masih Maud alayhi salam on the importance of spirituality and of removing materialism. But it is one thing to be sort of intellectually convinced of something, to know something as a theory, and it is completely different to actually be convinced of something and understand it on a deep level. And that barometer which I just described is one way of looking at it. That in reality, when we look at others around us, who impresses us and who are we unimpressed by? That perception with which we perceive others can give us an insight and a reflection into the true self that exists within ourselves. And then we can start to create a self-reformation according to that diagnosis that we can make. So this is one way of removing that materialism from within us, and this is something that Huzur Ayyadahullah Ta'ala bin Nasir al-Aziz has specifically emphasized for the United States Jamaat, that materialism is something that is starting to raise different types of tarbiyati issues, and removing that materialism is something that is imperative specifically for those Ahmadis, for those of us who are living in the United States. May Allah Almighty help us to remove this materialism and develop spirituality within ourselves. الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. There's just a couple of announcements. Please remember all members who are sick and going through treatment in your prayers. May Allah Almighty grant all of them full and speedy recovery. And also the Salat timings from tomorrow will be as follows. Fajr 6:15 a.m., Zuhr 1 p.m., Asr 4:30 p.m., Maghrib 6:15 p.m., and Isha 7:30 p.m. عباد الله رحمكم الله إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون اذكروا الله يذكركم وادعوه يستجب لكم ولذكر الله أكبر